Welcome back to my conversation with Leo Panitch and John Lansman. Leo is a senior scholar and professor emeritus of political science at York University in Toronto, and he's also the author of the book, The End of Parliamentary Socialism, From New Left to New Labour. And John Lansman is the founder of Momentum, an organization within the Labour Party that supports the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn. And he's also a member of the Labour Party's National Committee. I thank you both for joining me again.
Glad to be here, Sharmini.
All right, John, with no deal in place now as a result of this vote, there's a very real possibility of a so-called no-deal Brexit could happen on the 29th. This means that the UK would leave the EU with no transition agreement in place. Now, such a process could cause serious damage and perhaps displacement to the British economy because of the interconnectedness with the EU. So do you believe that that will be the effect of not having a deal at all?
Well, I think that would be the effect of not having a deal at all, but I think the chances are actually not that high of not having a deal at all at the moment. I think there is a majority in Parliament, a significant majority in Parliament, against not having any, leaving the EU without any deal. And I think it is likely, therefore, that will be avoided. If that is a threat, however, and it's a threat which May has been using in order to try, but unsuccessfully, in order to try and get Conservative MPs to vote for a deal. I think, but the one I think I would place on this a rather different emphasis than Leo did. I actually think that that there isn't that great a support in Parliament for. There isn't sufficient support in Parliament for a second referendum either, and I think that there are plenty of people who support, but in the Labour Party, or who support the Labour Party, but others too, who may, who would rather see us remain within the EU, but their support for a second referendum is somewhat conditional. That's certainly true of members of the Labour Party. We've, in Momentum, have consulted our members in order to find out their views. And although there is, and most Momentum members, just like most members of the Labour Party, would prefer to remain in the EU, or think it would be damaging to the economy and the community, their communities, if Britain was to leave the EU. But their support for a second referendum is pretty conditional. And in particular, it's conditional upon there being no chance of a general election, which they would very much prefer. Right. I also think it's wrong to think that if you have a second referendum, it will necessarily lead to remaining in the EU. And that's another reason why some people who support remaining in the EU are actually not favouring second referendum. It's true, as Leo said, that the Blairites are particularly pushing a second referendum, but they are now in a minority in the Labour Party. Even amongst the membership of the Labour Party, there's still there's still a significant number of MPs of that persuasion, but even they are in a minority within the parliamentary party. So I think that for the time being, at least for the next few days, perhaps weeks, I think the high level of unity that was, perhaps surprising level of unity that was shown on the EU at our conference at the end of September, will be preserved for a bit longer. I do think that we'll have the debate tomorrow on the confidence motion. I think there may well be other tactical moves. I think that the Tories have got us into this mess. They've spent 3 years faffing around, focusing entirely on on the EU on Brexit without actually making any progress towards it. It's really up to we would rather see they take responsibility for this, for the state they've got in, and for us to force a general election.
All right, Leo, I'm going to let you respond to John here, but let me preface that by asking you that 2.5 years ago, citizens of the UK voted in favor of leaving the EU, with the 52% of the vote in favor of leaving. Yet this last 2.5 years, much debate has taken place. The consciousness of the UK public is much more keen. People are much more aware of the issues, the consequences, and so forth. So so two things. One is respond to what John was just saying about a second referendum. And do you think that there would be a change in the outcome of such a referendum?
I think there might be. I think there's a danger, of course, that you now using the democratic pretext of having had one referendum. I mean, all kinds of other countries, including Ireland, have referendums and have them again until they get the right vote. There have been many referendums on the European Union that have been ignored, including those in France and Holland, which rejected the European Constitution, which implied much more than just the Constitution. That said, I think it is dangerous that the right will appeal to democracy, but really appeal to xenophobia, and be able to win over people, including working class people, with such a terrible appeal. I think that's to be feared. I hope it won't happen. I'd much prefer that, as John says, those who still would oppose putting a priority on the EU would put a priority because they want to see a Labour government and they want to see a socialist Labour government. I don't know what the outcome will be. I don't think people are all that much more informed. I think there's been a tremendous amount of scaremongering about what a Brexit will mean. It wouldn't have to change that much, in fact, depending on what was negotiated. And I do think that a Jeremy Corbyn-led negotiation would be a far more progressive one. And insofar as it offered more on the movement of people than the Tories are prepared to offer, things might be won from that. All of that said, I am somewhat dismayed that the socialist case has not been put forward nearly enough. Corbyn himself has spoken in terms of the issue being class divisions in Britain. He's done so recently in a number of speeches that have been good. But in order to overcome the terrible neoliberal capitalist austerity that the British working classes have faced, one really needs to be making the socialist case. And that has not been made. And it's not been made partly because of the divisions that we both were talking about in the Parliamentary Labour Party. I do think one is going to have to look at this in terms of socialist strategy. And as I was saying, in that sense, one needs to look at the EU in relation to what is the barrier to that in the EU? Should there be another vote, Labour is, and if that is forced, the Labour Party will have to be on the side, I would think, of staying in. But you'd want to make the case for staying in a way that would indicate that one would not be accepting the restrictions on a socialist strategy, which are much greater in terms, as I say, of the opposition from the City of London and indeed from the American Empire.
All right, John, let me give you the last word and get you to comment on your response to some of the arguments being put forward by Kostas Lapavitsas and others in the discussion that the left really needs to consider a left Brexit. Your response to that?
Well, look, I can quite understand the attraction to Kostas Lapavitsas of Greece being outside the EU. I don't think the same would be true. Well, I think that's in any case controversial. And I think Britain is in a different position. Unfortunately, Greece has been trampled by by Germany and other countries in the EU in the neoliberal interest, in the interest of preserving the current neoliberal structure of the EU. And I do think we're in a different position, which is why, though I am in some senses a Eurosceptic, I think that the EU needs massive reform, which I think is Jeremy's position too. I too campaign for Remain, and I would rather remain. But the difficulty we have is this. Our supporters, or if you include the people not just who voted for us at the last election, but people who voted for us at previous elections, are very divided. It's true that that amongst our members, there's overwhelming support for Remain. It's true that most Labour voters in the constituencies that we won support Remain. But unfortunately, in the constituencies that we have to win in order to form a government, there are many potential Labour voters who voted for Brexit, and therein lies the dilemma for the Labour Party. Our belief, it's not purely electoral interest that we're talking about. Our belief is that the most important thing for the British working class is that we have a Labour government under Corbyn that pursues the transformative economic programme that he and John McDonnell have been developing. And that would benefit Britain whether we ended up with some kind of soft Brexit. Rather better than the one that May has negotiated, or continuing to be within the EU. It's the economic programme that matters most, not whether we are in or out of the EU, though certainly we would want to avoid a hard Brexit.
All right, Leo, I see you nodding your head there.
Here.
Let me give you a chance to respond to the left case for leaving the EU.
I entirely agree with what John just said. And I guess the question is whether, as people in the United States say that workers who voted for Trump in the Midwest states would have voted for the kind of position that Sanders was laying out had he been the nominee of the Democratic Party. I guess the question is, if you put forward a clear class perspective of a left-wing kind, consistently, without backbiting from your own supporters in Parliament, whether you couldn't win them over, regardless of whether the issue was Brexit or not. That is, can you win over people who are open to xenophobic appeals by a progressive working class appeal? And I think there's a fear, and John knows, of course, the situation far, far better than I do, that in the short term, one couldn't win over those working class voters in the marginal constituencies. And I understand that. And I do think that there are tactical considerations here that need to be taken very seriously, because it is very important that this leadership of the Labour Party be allowed to unveil a socialist project for Britain. It'll be a sensible one. It'll be a gradual one. But it will be one of structural change of I think, entirely different kind than any previous government in British history.
All right, Leo. John, let's leave it there for now. This is obviously going to be an ongoing discussion, and I hope both of you join us again. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good to be with you, John.
And with you, Leo.
So long.
And Cheers. Thank you for joining us here on the Real News Network.